there was $1 million behind a blue door, would you let your kids go through it? I mean, think about that for just a moment. That's enough money that quite literally could probably set them for life. At least for a few years, so to speak. But what if I added a caveat to that? What if I said in order to get that money, they've got to be able to go into the room and they've got to come out safely? Would you still allow them to go in? Now, as you're thinking about that, what if I told you that 85 to 88% don't make it out alive? What are you thinking now? I suspect most of you are looking at that thinking, no, I don't like those odds at all. Because, I mean, think about it for just a moment. 85 to 88% death rate, that's not enough for us to want to be risking $1 million. Would you still let them go in that room? And as you're thinking about that, let me see if we can get our computers and monitors talking here. Maybe. He's working on it. As you're thinking about that, folks, those are the exact numbers that we're talking about when we send our kids off to school. 85 to 88% we are losing every single year. All because they're going after what we basically told them is success. What we've got to do is we've got to learn to inoculate them. And by that I mean we've got to do a much better job of getting them ready to defend their faith. In medicine, the word inoculate means basically we give them a little bit of something over time in order that they can withstand. And that's what we've got to do in the church. We've got to learn to inoculate our kids. Let me share with you an experiment that was done a couple of years ago. Researcher in California carried out an experiment to find out what does it take for our children to give up their beliefs. They basically wanted to know how easy is it for young people, and in this case it was actually college students, to completely abandon something they believed in. Now, they didn't want to mess with their faith because they realized that might have lifelong consequences. So they decided to choose something that they felt like would not be quite as damaging. They decided to try to get these college kids to give up their toothbrush. Some of you are kind of looking at me going, yeah, that's just about as nasty. Here's what they did. They paid an actor. They gave him a white starched lab coat. Put a lot of initials after his name. This guy's job was to convince these young people to give up their toothbrush. So he comes prepared. He's got his PowerPoint slides. He's got charts. He's got graphs. He's got everything. He's ready. Now, if I were to tell you your child is going to go into a room, they're going to try to give him to get up their toothbrush, do you think this guy could do it? Most of you probably think, not my kid. You know, I've been telling them since they were like 2, brush your teeth every day. Here's what they did. They took 6 groups. And for lack of ease tonight, we're going to say each group had 100 students in it. The very first group, they literally did nothing. They literally just sent them in. The guy begins to wax on eloquently about how brushing your teeth is harmful. In fact, toothpaste itself causes cancer. And he talks to them about how the bristles on a toothbrush actually will leave pits in which bacteria grow. And I mean, this guy was good. After many minutes, what he had done is he had taken a group of people who believed in brushing their teeth. He had totally convinced them to stop doing that, to get rid of that idea. And after about an hour, most of them did just that. Most of them gave up their toothbrush. The second group, right before they sent them in, they gave them a reminder. They told them, they said, you have been taught since you were little that you need to brush your teeth. Now, we want you to go listen to this guy. And they sent him in. And sure enough, this guy was good. After about an hour, he told them all the same things. He showed them the same charts, same graphs. After about an hour, guess what? They gave up their toothbrush as well. Group number 3, they gathered them up. They reminded them that brushing their teeth was good, but they also warned them. They said, we're about to send you into a room where a guy's going to try to get you to give up your toothbrush. And they sent him in. And sure enough, the guy goes through his whole spiel. And sure enough, a lot of those students gave up their toothbrush. The next group, group number 4, they got the reminder. They got the warning. But they also got the guy's arguments. They said, you're going to go into this room and this guy's going to try to get you to give up your toothbrush. And he's going to tell you things like toothpaste causes cancer. He's going to tell you that the bristles could leave pits that bacteria could grow in. And they sent them in. And believe it or not, some of them even gave up their toothbrush. Group number 5, they got the reminder. They got the warning. They got the guy's arguments, but they also got answers to the arguments. They told him, they said, this guy's going to tell you that toothpaste causes cancer. He's not going to tell you you got to eat 57 gallons a day in order for that to happen. He's going to tell you that the bristles of a toothbrush will leave pits, but he's not going to tell you that enamel of teeth is one of the toughest substances. And they went on, and they sent this group in. Finally, the 6th group was the last one. Now, bear in mind, they had gotten all this stuff. They had gotten the reminder. The 6th group got the warnings. They got the guy's arguments. They got answers to his arguments. But this 6th group, they had one added component. They gathered them up. They said, look, we're going to send you into this room. He's going to show you some things. In fact, he may show you some stuff that we haven't talked about. They gave him logic, reasoning. They said that doesn't change the very real fact that brushing your teeth is good for you. And no matter what he throws out to you, that is not going to change the very real truth that we know brushing your teeth is good. They sent him in. Now, if I asked you, which group do you think did the best? Obviously, it was group number 6, right? Which group do you think did the worst? Now, most of us would say group number 1. It was actually group number 2. Remember the group that just got the reminder? And you say, Brad, well, why does it matter? Why are you standing up there talking to us, of all things, about toothbrushes? Folks, the reason I'm telling you this is because if a paid actor can get your child to give up a toothbrush after 1 hour, you think about what a professor can do to their faith in 1 semester. You see, that's the reality that we're facing. And we've got a lot of our young people who are giving up their toothbrushes literally in that very first semester of college. They go off, and here's the scary part to me. Remember the group that did the worst, group number 2? The group that just got that reminder. You know what that sounds like to me? That sounds like to me a set of Christian parents who looks at their children and says, now we've told you from the time you were little that God exists. Now go get your degree. And they haven't been inoculated. They haven't got what they need in order to defend their faith. Tonight, what I want us to do first is get the PowerPoint working.
He said it's probably in your computer.
Probably in my computer.
Yeah. He didn't send me down here to fix it. He just delivered a message.
Well, let's see if we can fix that. Aha. It was not my computer, it was the plug. That, I'm not going to say that was a PC problem, but I'm using a Mac, so you know. Operator problem. What I want us to do is I want us to talk a little bit this evening about the age of the earth. You know, statements like these are very common in textbooks. They talk about things happening millions or billions of years ago. And what I want us to do is I want us to start literally where many of the textbooks start. I was very pleased last night. I got to meet a lot of you. One gentleman came up, told me that he was a science teacher, and he asked me, he said, do you know what we have to start every single year with? What chapter 1 is? And I said, that would probably be the Big Bang. He said, yep, that's it. The origins, the idea of where everything came from. And so that's kind of where I would like for us this evening to start. This idea of this alleged Big Bang that happened 18 to 20 billion years ago. I had a youth minister ask me the question you see on the screen, could God have used the Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Before I answer that question, what I want to do is I want to spend just a few minutes of your time talking about the science side of the Big Bang. Because in all reality, it's miserable science. I mean, think about it for just a moment. None of those textbooks actually tells us where the original matter for the universe came from. What it does is it starts with a bang, and allegedly in about 3.4 seconds, everything radiates out into space into an ordered universe. Now, folks, my 10-year-old child is smart enough to realize there's a problem with that. My second son, his name is Reese. We were driving around my hometown, and out of nowhere, he said, Dad, that's kind of dumb, isn't it? And I'm thinking, wait a second, do I need to pull this car over? What's dumb? I said, Reese, what are you talking about? He said, the idea that an explosion would cause an ordered universe. And I thought, man, my kid's getting it. This is great. I said, Reese, you're absolutely right. I said, can you imagine what would happen if we took a stick of dynamite and we put that in your bedroom and we blew it up? He laughed. He said, it probably wouldn't look any different, would it, Dad? Now, while he doesn't realize the very real fact that this is violating the first two laws of thermodynamics, I want to make sure everybody in this room understands that it is. Number one, you are creating matter. That violates the first law. Number two, the second law says everything should be going towards disorder or chaos. Violates number two as well, doesn't it? So how do they get around that? How do they teach our kids this alleged Big Bang theory that quite literally right off the ground has to violate scientific laws? Well, let's let them answer. A fellow by the name of Paul Davies, he's an evolutionist. He says the Big Bang represents the instantaneous suspension of physical laws, the sudden abrupt flash of lawlessness that allowed something to come out of nothing. It represents a true miracle. Now, my question is, why is that more scientific than saying, in the beginning, God did this? Because as we talked about last night, folks, they don't want God anywhere around. And so what we do is we set aside the real data and we teach our kids that all of this stuff happened long time ago in a land far away. Well, let's look at that for just a moment. Scientifically speaking, we know that Jupiter is far, far too hot for there to have been a Big Bang. What do I mean by that? I mean, this alleged explosion happened 18 to 20 billion years ago. It should have long cooled off by now, and yet we know scientifically it is still giving off twice as much heat as it's receiving from the sun. In fact, we know that the moons that NASA has photographed that are going around Jupiter, folks, they've got volcanoes going off. In fact, we know that the moons around Jupiter, Ganymede, for instance, It's got a molten liquid core. Why is that a big deal? Because if the Big Bang happened billions of years ago, that shouldn't be. I mean, quite literally, this is a scientific evidence that we're overlooking. Now, here's the dirty little secret in science. Almost all intellectually honest scientists recognize the Big Bang, it's dead, it's a bad theory. But it will not be taken out of the textbooks until we have another godless theory to replace it. Let me show you a quote from a guy by the name of Bob Berman. This is an astronomer. He was actually writing in the journal Astronomy to his fellow colleagues when he suggested that a warning be placed before every article that talks about the Big Bang. Take a look at his warning. It says, warning, the following contains contemporary cosmology. Reading it can produce disorientation and confusion. Nobody knows what's going on, and nothing you read here is likely to be true. Now, that's one astronomer to his fellow astronomers. How do we present it to students? As fact. Let's get back to that question for just a moment. Could God have used a Big Bang to get us to where we are today? Folks, all we need are the first two verses of God's Word. If you got a Bible, you might go ahead and take it out. Genesis chapter 1, verses 1 and 2. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. The earth was without form and void. Darkness was upon the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God moved upon the surface of the waters. According to the Bible, that very first day, this earth was a water-covered heavenly body. Remember, God hadn't brought forth land yet. It was quite literally covered with water. Now, from a scientific perspective, do we know the boiling point of water? Absolutely. Depending on which system you use, whether you use Fahrenheit or Celsius, it's either 100 degrees or 212. Folks, that Big Bang took place at a temperature you and I can't fathom. It was allegedly in the millions of degrees. So how do you go from a million-degree explosion to having a water-covered heavenly body on the same day? Fact is, you can't. Because what would happen to all the water? It would instantly turn to steam. It would be gone, right? Add to that the very real fact that the Bible indicates the sun, the moon, the stars, they didn't come into the picture until day 4. Now, folks, you put those two together, and you realize there is no way to squeeze this Big Bang into God's creation account. Not unless you are willing to compromise. And somebody says, no, wait a second, Brad. Hold on. Maybe each one of those days wasn't really a day. Maybe each one of those days was long periods of time, millions of years. Again, if you've got a Bible, take a look with me, Genesis chapter 1, and look with me at verse 5, verse 8, verse 13, verse 19, where Moses records over and over the same phrase. He says, so evening and morning were the first day. So evening and morning were the second day. Notice what he's doing. He is putting a punctuation at the end of God's creative activities. He calls it an evening and a morning, and then he gives it a numerical adjective. He says, day 1, day 2, day 3. Now look at verse 14. Then God said, let there be lights in the firmament of the heaven to divide the day from the night, and let them be for signs and season, for days and for years. Folks, if these were not 24-hour days as you and I recognize it, but rather millions of years, what's he talking about in verse 14 when he specifically mentions days, years, and even seasons? You know, if you really want to know, was this a 24-hour day or was this millions of years? All you got to do is use a little bit of common sense. If I asked you, what day were all the green flowering plants created on? What do you think? Oh, see, I'm going to have to go to the kids because y'all weren't in VBS. What day did God create the green flowering plants and stuff? Day 3. Okay, so in Genesis chapter 1, verses 9 through 13, we find out God made all the stuff on day 3. Now, if I asked you, what does that plant need in order to reproduce and grow? Obviously, we know it's got to have water, it's got to have sunlight. We're going to say that all of that stuff is present or will be fairly soon. But it doesn't just need water and sunlight, does it? It also has to have the right atmosphere. It's got to have the right nutrients in the soil. But most importantly, it also has to be pollinated, doesn't it? Folks, without those little pesky insects, the bees, we don't move pollen around. And without moving pollen around, guess what? Those plants don't produce seeds or fruit. Now, as you're thinking about that, what day were all the flying creatures created on? I'll give you a hint. It was day 5. Now, is anybody in this room really ready to take the position that each one of these days was millions of years? That would mean God put all the green flowering plants here on day 3, and we had to wait 2 million years before they could be pollinated? Folks, that's illogical. Open your Bible to Exodus chapter 20, verse 11. Exodus chapter 20, you remember God is handing down the 10 Commandments. Verse 11 says, "For in 6 days the Lord made the heaven, the earth, the seas, and all that in them is." So he made everything, the text says, in 6 days. Now, keep that in the forefront of your mind and flip over to Exodus chapter 31. Exodus chapter 31, and look with me starting in about verse 14. The Bible says, "You shall keep the Sabbath, therefore, for it is holy to you. Everyone who profanes it shall surely be put to death. For whoever does any work on it, that person shall be cut off from among his people. Work shall be done for 6 days, but the 7th is Sabbath of rest, holy to the Lord. Whoever does any work on the Sabbath day, he shall surely be put to death. Therefore, the children of Israel shall keep the Sabbath, to observe the Sabbath throughout their generations as a perpetual covenant. It is a sign between me and the children of Israel forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the 7th day he rested and was refreshed." What was the punishment for somebody working on day 7? It was death. Now, again, can anybody in their right mind picture 2 Israelites standing up together having the following conversation? Well, you know, I really think that we're supposed to work 6 long eons of time and rest 1 eon of time. Or do you think they knew I'm to work 6 days, be off on the 7th, just like God did? Now, right about now, there's at least 2 or 3 of you in this room, and your mind is twirling and clicking, and you're sitting there thinking, yeah, but somewhere in the Bible it says something about a day to the Lord is 1,000 years, and 1,000 years is a day. And you're right, it does. In fact, you'll find that in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8. But before I let you rip that horribly out of context and drop that into the creation account, let's first ask ourselves this. What were they talking about in 2 Peter chapter 3, verse 8? You remember the people were getting impatient. They wanted to know, when is he coming again? He said, look, God doesn't count time the way you do. Day to the Lord's 1,000 years. 1,000 years is a day. Now, if I let you rip that out of context and drop it into the creation week, please understand a couple of things. Number one, you've only bought yourself 6,000 years. Evolution takes millions. But more importantly, number 2, if you rip that out of context, that word for day in 2 Peter 3:8, that's the same word we find in talking about Jesus being in the tomb for 3 days and 3 nights. Anybody want to stretch that out to 3,000 years? Or what about Jonah in the belly of a fish? You want to put him in the belly of a fish for 3,000 years? Can you imagine the smell? You know, it's interesting to me. For some reason, Christians desperately, we want to stretch out creation to try to accommodate evolution. But we don't want to put Jesus in the tomb any longer than 3 days. Folks, you want me to tell you why? It's because society is influencing us more than we're influencing society. We got to show folks that the truth can be known. And folks, listen to me, the truth is right in line with this book. In fact, John 17:17, thy word is truth. Now, if you're in here and you're still thinking, well, maybe I can marry the two together. Two problems with that. Number one, the Bible says you got water first, then land. Evolution says land first, then water. Now, as you're thinking about that, where'd the water come from? I mean, think about it. Roughly 3/4 of the Earth's surface is covered in water. Where'd the water come from? Everybody in this room is very familiar with the water cycle, right? But in order to have a water cycle, you got to have what? Water. Some of you may have read yesterday, there was a report, came out on Yahoo, that it was the asteroids that delivered water to the earth. Last time I checked, I didn't know they were water deliverers. And last time I checked, we've never seen that happen scientifically. How did the water get here, folks? Because in order to have water, or to have rain, to have that cycle, you've got to have water. Isn't it interesting? The very first day, God already deals with that. He makes water. You realize evolutionists can't even explain the very presence of water, which is why, by the way, they're looking for it anywhere they can find it out in space to try to discount God. The other problem with trying to harmonize the idea of evolution in the Bible is very plain that man is intelligent from day one, or day 6, I guess. But the reality is God created man with intelligence. That's not what evolution says. Evolution says after long periods of time, we finally got smart. Again, you may be looking at me saying, Brad, what does all this matter? Who really cares? Well, folks, let me tell you why this matters. Let me just land a plane for you. Everybody in this room understands that there are 2 divisions in the Bible, right? Old and New Testament. From this point on, I want you to start thinking about 3. And I want you to put that 3rd division in Genesis chapter 3. And here's why. What was man's relationship like to God prior to Genesis 3? We were in a covenant relationship. In fact, I'm not really sure anybody in this room can appreciate it. The fact that God would quite literally walk through the midst of man. In Genesis chapter 3, that relationship is shattered. Listen to me. The entire rest of the book is trying to tell us how to get back into that covenant relationship, ultimately through Jesus Christ. If you take out Adam and Eve and you take out the creation account, what you are doing is you are removing the whole scheme of redemption of man. That's why it matters. And that's why we got to make sure our kids understand that compromising, quite literally from the very first verse, is no good. I talked a little bit about water. Take a look at this. This is a biology textbook. It says, about 3.9 billion years ago, the earth had cooled enough for water vapor to condense. The earth was, for the first time, experiencing violent rainstorms. Eventually, the accumulated rainfall formed the earth's oceans. So apparently there were these outer space rainstorms that filled up our oceans, along with the asteroids. They were working with like Culligan, Crystal Springs Water Division, right? Again, I'll say this, folks, that takes a whole lot more faith than believing in God. You say, but Brad, I hear what you're saying, and I believe the Bible, but everything looks so old. I mean, just, Brad, look at the rocks. They look so old. Okay, could somebody in this room please tell me, what does a young rock look like? It's not like they have diapers on, okay? You see, we've all been convinced that this geologic column is real. You know the geologic column, those vast old ages, the Triassic, the Jurassic, the Carboniferous period, the Cretaceous period. Had a young man one time, I asked him, I said, are you familiar with it? He began to rattle it off, just boom, 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 boom. He said, I've been tested on it. I said, well, did they actually teach you about how this geologic column came into formation? He looked at me and said, no, they didn't tell us that. I said, no, I didn't think they would, because it was actually formed in the 1800s based almost solely on assumption. You see, in the 1800s, we had absolutely no idea how long it took for these different striatal layers to be laid down. So you know what we did? We assumed, and we put old numbers by it. We didn't know how long it took for a canyon to be formed. And so again, what did we do? We assumed. Well, folks, 32 years ago, something happened that blew all of our assumptions away, and it's quite literally changed the whole field of geology. 32 years ago, Mount St. Helens erupted. For those of you sitting out there saying, was it really 32? Yes, you are that old. It was 32 years ago. 32 years ago, it erupted, and with that eruption, folks, I need you to understand, this is the most studied volcano on the planet. We learned a whole lot that our kids aren't learning. My son and I, we were there for the 30th anniversary, and I want to share with you 5 things that we learned firsthand. We're going to use the acronym SUPER, S-U-P-E-R. 5 things that we learned from Mount St. Helens that point to a very, very young Earth. The first one deals with those striatal layers, S. If you look on the screen, you'll notice all of these different layers. Each one of them have long periods of time by it. 100 million years. That's what we used to think. In fact, if I show you this picture here, you can actually see the layering. That rock bluff's about 120 feet tall. The reason I know that, my son and I, we stood right here as we were filming some of the DVD. Take a look at the top of that. According to evolutionists, that top rock, they would call that sedimentary rock. They say it's over 100 million years old. The only problem with that is everything you're looking at was laid down 32 years ago in a matter of just a couple of weeks. All of it. In fact, we've got video evidence of some of it. For instance, the picture you're looking at here, everything below that first bottom line, all of that was laid down in the initial eruption, May the 18th, 1980. There was a secondary eruption about a month later, June the 20th, that put everything down between the 2 layers. There was another eruption about 2 years later that put everything on top. Here's my point. Everything you are looking at right there, folks, was put down in 2 years. Not 2,000, not 2 million. And here's the funnier part. You see all that material? Most of you in this room are older than those rocks. So when your kids and grandkids say, you're old as a rock, in some aspects, they may be telling the truth. So the S is for rapid striatal layers. You see all these layers, folks? That was laid down in literally days, not months and years. The U stands for upright logs. There's a lake on the north sector of Mount St. Helens called Spirit Lake. When the volcano erupted, all of the trees on the neighboring ridges and mountains, they were all flushed down into this particular lake. A buddy of mine by the name of Dr. Steve Austin, he has been doing extensive work in Spirit Lake. You'll see him actually at the very bottom of the screen in scuba gear with one of his colleagues. He has been recording what's going on both in Mount St. Helens and in the lake, how quick it's coming back. And he showed me video footage of what's going on in the water. He told me, he said, Brad, these logs are staying on top of the water for decades in a log mat. And he said after many, many years, what happens is they become completely water saturated, and then the heavy root end will sink down, and they'll bob straight up and down in the water. He said they'll remain that way for years until they finally sink down very slowly, standing straight up. He showed me footage. He said it looks just like a forest at the bottom of this particular lake. Now, That's what we're seeing at the bottom of Spirit Lake, caused by a catastrophe. And folks, that's what we're seeing in the fossil record as well. Just to make sure everybody understands what you're looking at, take a look. There are 3 men at the bottom of this rock bluff. Those are 5 fossilized trees. They're standing straight up. But you'll notice they're going through several different layers. How in the world do you have a tree that starts out growing, say, in the Carboniferous period, the coal era, and goes up through the Triassic? Folks, that's more than 150 million years. If you're a tree, are you going to stick around for 150 million years? Or are you going to decay and rot? Now, here's the funny thing. We've got these things quite literally all over the globe. For instance, my family and I, we were up in Nova Scotia a couple of months ago. The Fundy Bay, there's a place where you can see all kinds of these fossils that go through several different layers. And yet, if you think about it for just a moment, these should not exist, folks. I mean, how in the world is it that we've got fossilized trees that are going up through multiple layers? Well, the answer is, these totally undo the geologic column by themselves. This says in Germany, France, the British Isles, Nova Scotia, California, several eastern states, fossils that extend through several layers of sedimentary rock have been found. These are called polystrate fossils. How do we explain them? We explain them because of a catastrophe. They make sense to me because I believe in a global flood. So the U is for upright logs. The P is for peat formation. This is an aerial shot that we took over Spirit Lake. You'll notice the big log mat that is still there. There's over 38,000 logs still floating. If you were to go down and look at those logs, there's not a stitch of bark on any of them. And the reason being, they've been bumping together for 30 years. All of the bark is in the bottom of that lake. My buddy Steve Austin, he showed me, he said, Brad, we've got areas where there are several feet of peat beds. Now, why is that a big deal? The bark on these trees has turned to peat. The peat's in the bottom of the lake. Why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because peat is a precursor for making coal. They're watching during the lifetime of men coal being formed in the bottom of Spirit Lake. And folks, we used to think that coal was laid down 250 million years ago, before the dinosaurs. And yet we're realizing that under catastrophic conditions, you can do it a whole lot quicker. The E is for eroding canyons. Now, if I didn't tell you anything at all about the picture you're looking at on the screen, other than those canyons are about 600 feet deep, you might think that that river right in the middle, that river carved out that canyon, because that's what we're often told, isn't it? Well, folks, what you're looking at right there was formed in about 3 days. And the reason that I know that, if you look very carefully at Mount St. Helens, when it erupted, it didn't just go straight up. It also came out just a little bit. Now, right before it erupted, the mountain itself was actually growing in girth 15 to 35 feet per day. I tell young people, it looked like a big zit just waiting to erupt. Right before it did, all of the snow and the ice on this sector slid down into the valley. And then it erupted, and all the lava came pouring out. And what do you think happens to snow and ice when it comes in contact with lava? Remember that whole boiling point thing? It immediately turned to steam. And folks, steam has got to go somewhere. And it blew canyon vents 600 feet deep. Now, why is that a big deal? It's a big deal because scientifically speaking, I can look every single one of you in the eyes and tell you, hey, we know scientifically you can form a 600-foot canyon in a matter of days. And yet our kids are being told, over millions of years, the Colorado River has carved out the Grand Canyon from rock. I want to see something. If you remember being told that that river carved the Grand Canyon, would you please just raise your hand? Okay, most everybody. Okay, if you don't remember anything else from this lesson, when you leave here, remember that river didn't carve the canyon. I'm going to prove it to you, but let's look at what we've actually got. We know that it's a fact the Grand Canyon exists, right? You can go see it. There are two different interpretations. You've got evolutionists who would say it was formed slowly by a little bit of water over a lot of time. But you got creationists who say, wait a second, Mount St. Helens is a living laboratory. We believe that it could be formed quickly by a lot of water over a little amount of time. The problem is evolutionists are trying to erase the line between their interpretation and what is a fact, and so our kids are reading sentences like this. The Colorado River is cut through layer upon layer of rock over millions of years. Okay, now I asked you guys, how many of you had been taught this? Most of you. Here's my rationale of saying that river didn't carve out the canyon. We know, scientifically speaking, that the river enters the canyon at an elevation of 2,800 feet. You can't dispute it. We also know that the south rim, the area that everybody looks over and you look at it and you say, wow, that is beautiful, it's sitting at an elevation of 6,900 feet. In order for that river to have carved that canyon, it would have had to flow uphill about 4,000 feet, folks. Now, I'm not a hydrologist, but I do know water doesn't go uphill. It seeks the lowest level. How in the world is it they're going to keep trying to brainwash our kids, telling us that river carved the canyon when it would require water to do this right here? A couple of things I know. Number one, top of the canyon's much, much higher than the bottom. Number two, the river only goes through the bottom of the canyon. Number three, you got a 4,000-foot elevation change. Number four, rivers don't flow uphill. And maybe somebody in this room could tell me, if the river carved the canyon, where's all the stuff? Where's the delta? You see, when you really look at the evidence, it makes a whole lot more sense that maybe there was a catastrophe that carved out that canyon. So the E is for rapidly eroding canyons. The R is for rapid recovery. Rapid recovery. I took this picture about 3 minutes into the blast zone, our very first day in Mount St. Helens, and as you can tell, stuff is back, isn't it? You know, when it originally erupted, it was quite literally a blank slate. It looked like an atomic bomb had gone off. Everything was dead. Everything was covered in this lava, this pyroclastic flow. And after a couple of short years, the elk were actually some of the first ones to come back. Elk have got very, very tough hooves, and as they would cross those hardened lava flows, it would break the lava, and then elk do what elk do. They fertilized, and all of a sudden, stuff starts coming back. And folks, as you can tell from that picture, there's all kinds of things back. They originally said it was going to take 120,000 years for stuff to come back. And then they revised their numbers and they said maybe 60,000. Well, guess what? That's 30. Not 30,000, 30 years. You see, they were going on an evolutionary time scale. Now, here's what I want everybody in this room to think about for just a moment. If evolution is true, Mount St. Helens provided a blank slate. And by that I mean everything was wiped out. In the blink of an eye, everything is gone. So could somebody in this room please tell me, why didn't we evolve new species? Why don't we have new plants or new animals? Or furthermore, why didn't we get animals that are like volcano-proof? You know, mice with Kevlar umbrellas or something. We didn't get it because it's a fairy tale. And folks, everything that I've shown you is not my opinion. It's not a hypothesis. Every bit of it is a scientific fact that they're withholding from our kids. And the reason that they're withholding it from our kids is, what is one thing evolutionists have got to have lots and lots and lots of? They got to have a lot of time. And you see, when you show them the truth about Mount St. Helens, what you are doing, quite literally, is you are ripping away millions of years. You're totally dismantling that geologic column. In fact, let me show you a page out of a teacher's edition just to kind of impress upon you what they're being taught. It says, stress that the earth is thought to be at least 4.5 billion years old. Why do we stress that? Because without that much time, it's not getting off the ground. You say, okay, Brad, I hear what you're saying, but do we have any other evidence that things aren't as old? Well, let's take a look very quickly. What about, for instance, magnets? You know, a lot of you have got magnets on your refrigerator, maybe pictures of your grandkids. A couple of things we know about magnets. Like, for instance, we know, number one, that they lose their strength over time. We also know that the earth has a magnetic core around it. You say, how do you know that for sure? Ask a Boy Scout to hold a compass. You know what it points to? Not just north. Magnetic north. The third thing that we know for sure about magnetism is the earth has lost 6% of its magnetism the last 150 years. That's a scientific fact. We can't refute it. Now, folks, look at that for just a moment. We've lost 6% in 150 years. You know what that tells me? That tells me there's no way the earth can be billions of years old, or else we'd have no magnetism left. It also tells me that carbon dating, radiometric dating, that is dependent on uniformity is no good. Because stuff is changing, isn't it? Or what about the Sahara Desert? What is it telling us about the age of the earth? You know, we know that right now, as we speak, the Sahara Desert is growing roughly about a foot a year. It's a process called desertification. About 2 weeks ago, I was in Germany off of a U.S. air base. Was talking to some soldiers, and they were telling me, they said, Brad, I've seen it firsthand. And they began to describe the way that the winds were coming in. What they are experiencing is the fact that every single year it is moving southward. You see on the screen the yellow area where it used to be, the peach area where it is today, and at the very bottom of the screen you'll notice this hatched area, the direction it's moving. Now, we could extrapolate backwards and we can ask ourselves, okay, if we know how fast it's growing today, how old is the Sahara Desert? The answer is about 4,000 years. You say, wait, time out, Brad. Didn't you tell us yesterday that according to the genealogies in the Bible, everything's about 6,000 years old? Yeah, but what happened about 4,000 years ago that put all of our weather patterns into place? How about the flood? Would that do it? Yeah, it would. I show this picture for two reasons. Number one, I think it gives a pretty good indication of what's going wrong in our education system today. And number two, it's great evidence for a young earth. If there are Christian educators in this room, let me first thank you because you know you're serving on the front line. But I think you'll agree with me. Right now we're living under this whole no child left behind era that is leaving everybody behind, folks. Because what it is doing, it is making our children professional test takers. Standardized test takers. And they're no longer thinking critically. In fact, I know the kids over here aren't going to like me much. We're producing some dumb kids. They don't think logically. You know what they do? They memorize trivia. Now, why is that a big deal to me? It's a big deal for multiple reasons, but moms and dads, listen to me carefully, please. They're taking the same approach when it comes to Bible. They're memorizing what they think is trivia to be able to regurgitate it in a Bible class, and it is never settling in right here. Let me show you what I mean by this. Take a look at the screen. It says, for example, the Mississippi River deposits sediment at a rate of 80,000 tons an hour. Our kids, being the test takers they are, they memorize two things. Mississippi River, 80,000 tons an hour. They're ready to take the test. But they don't stop and actually think about that. If the Mississippi River is dumping 80,000 tons of sediment every single hour, which it is, how much further should that stretch out if this earth really is 4.6 billion years old? Well, folks, the answer would be there should be no Gulf of Mexico. It should have already filled in by now. And while we're talking about the Gulf of Mexico, what about the water? Folks, we know precisely how much salt is in the ocean. It's sitting at 3.6 right now. And we also know how quickly it is accumulating more salt because of the water cycle. You remember the water evaporates up, clouds move over land, rain down, picks up salt and minerals from the land, deposits them in the ocean. We know precisely how fast this thing is working. We're sitting at 3.6 right now. Scientifically speaking, we could have gone from freshwater to saltwater in less than 5,000 years. You know what that tells me? That tells me scientifically there's no way that this earth is billions of years old, or else the oceans would be far more salty. In fact, they'd be too salty to sustain life. As you're thinking about this, what I'm trying to show you is the true evidence points out this thing's not that old. What about oil? Here we are in Texas. You guys live it and breathe it. I'm a Tennessee boy. I don't know as much about oil as you do, but I am going to share that one piece of trivia that I learned out in the West Texas plains. And that is never, ever place your finger over an oil cap. The reason being, some of the oil underground is held under pressure as high as 20,000 pounds per square inch, 20,000 psi. Now, in order for you to really get that, your car tires right now, they're inflated probably to about 35 psi. This is 20,000. It would literally, if it went, it would take your finger right off your hand. But there again, what we've got to do is we've got to start thinking critically and ask logical questions like, how long can rock hold oil under that kind of pressure? Well, folks, we've got the instruments to measure it, and the answer is less than 10,000 years. Okay, where did it come from? We'll take a look. This is from a textbook. It says, the other two major fossil fuels are petroleum and natural gas. The formation of these two fuels is not yet fully understood. That is an understatement. They say both are thought to have formed from the decay of organisms that once lived in the sea. The remains of these organisms settled to the seafloor. They were gradually covered by sediment. After millions of years, the remains were slowly changed by heat and pressure. Okay, so they're saying all of this stuff was covered over, and that heat and pressure, they would add millions of years, changed it into oil and gas. Okay, is there any other explanation that might help us understand how all of this stuff could have been covered over? Like, for instance, would a flood do it? Yeah, that would do it. Now, while we're talking about that, God created a mature creation. You say, what are you talking about, Brett? God created a mature creation, and I know that because he told Adam, you can eat from the fruit of any of these trees except this one. So what were the trees already producing? They were already producing fruit. So here's what I want us to think about. Let's say that Dean and I, we get an invitation to go to the very first wedding ceremony. Okay? God says, I'm going to transport you guys back in time. You're going to get to see Adam and Eve joined together as man and wife. Now, we're excited. And we don't want to show up empty-handed. We know, you're supposed to take a wedding present. Now, we're guys. We're not going to take china or towels because that's not what guys do. We want something cool. So we go to Lowe's and we buy the biggest McCullough chainsaw we can find. Okay? We wrap that up. We go back in time. We hand that to Adam. He rips it open. He looks at, fires that thing up. He goes out into the garden and he cuts down a tree. How many rings would that tree have on it? Because that tree is 3 days old. So I'll say it again. He created a mature creation. A mature creation in which Adam and Eve could look out at the stars and already be receiving what? Starlight. Do I think that there were already fossil fuels or coal, gas, things like that? Absolutely. You don't know why? Because when you're reading through Genesis chapter 2, it already starts talking about them finding things like gold and bdellium and onyx stones in the ground. Why? Folks, you don't need gold or onyx stones to garden. No, but you know what? I think God gave us everything we would need to worship Him and to live fruitful lives. Every time you look at it, what you're seeing is, in fact, take a look. Genesis chapter 2, you're seeing that God was 5 steps ahead of us all along the way. Genesis chapter 2, look with me. Oh, let's see. Look with me at verse 15. The Lord God took man, put him in the Garden of Eden to tend and keep it. Stop right there. Do you realize the very first context we have of man and God is in the context of what? His work. Do you realize that God expected Adam to work before Eve was even created? Folks, I am firmly of the belief if Adam and Eve were still here, guess what Adam would still be doing? He'd be tending and keeping the garden, had he not sinned. You see, when man sinned, it wasn't work that was added as a punishment. It was making the work what? Harder. Now, I tell you guys that because I need you to understand God has always intended for man to work. If you are on this planet and you think you deserve a free ride, folks, that is unbiblical. Now, you say, Brad, okay, I hear everything you're saying. Give me some more evidence. Show me that everything fits the Bible as neatly as you think. How about Niagara Falls? You know, right now water is going over the leading edge of the falls at a tremendous rate. In fact, every single year what it's doing is it's receding the leading edge of the falls. It's wearing it backwards. And if you look at the screen, you'll notice there are lines where the leading edge of the falls used to be at certain years. It's been wearing back at roughly 4.7 feet a year. Now again, we can ask the question, if this earth is billions of years old, how deep should the Niagara Gorge be? The answer is should have lapped the globe a couple of times. And yet, when we actually do the calculation, notice this. It shows that it has been 9,900 years since the Niagara River started cutting its gorge back. That's a whole lot closer to my numbers than their numbers. And you look at me and you say, I hear you, Brad, but man, my family and I, we took a vacation and we went to Carlsbad Caverns, and the guy told us, he said, don't touch those stalactites because it has taken millions of years for them to form. And the oils from your fingers will slow it down. Anybody ever heard that? Oh, yeah. Tiny drops of water over millions of years. Does it take millions of years for a stalactite? Well, let's see. What you're looking at on the screen, that's the Lincoln Memorial that was built in 1922. Or how about this one? That's a lead mine in Australia. You may not be able to see it from where you're sitting. There's actually stalactites hanging from the switch sign that was installed by men. Or how about this one? Hopefully I don't have to tell you, indoor plumbing's not been around for millions of years, has it? There is a place, if you ever get a chance to go, it's over in Yorkshire. It's called Mother Shipton's Cave. You can take an object, a teddy bear, a hat, you can tie it to a string, come back in 3 days, and it is completely encased like a stalactite. Not 3 years, not 3 million years. I actually had the opportunity about 3.5 weeks ago, I was up in Scotland, had the opportunity to actually hold one of the teddy bears that you're seeing on the screen. Hard as a rock. You see, folks, these things don't take nearly as long as they would like us to believe. This one is intriguing. This is a bat encased in a stalagmite. Now, you got to ask yourself, did that little bat just stand there while tiny drops of water hit him over millions of years? Or have we been sold by a bad bill of goods? Because you see, the evidence exists. The problem is, when evidence comes in that discounts evolution, they're not showing it to our kids. What they're doing, instead of throwing out the theory, they're throwing out the evidence. Let me show you one more piece of evidence before I let you take a break. In Wyoming, there's a place called TP Fountain. It was formed in 1903. It was started. This particular thing is a hot spring. It's a mineral spring that was coming up in the center of town. And a man took a lead pipe and he jammed it into this hot spring. Water was coming up over it. Now, this was a mineral spring. You know how sometimes water will leave mineral deposits on your plumbing? Okay, but this was leaving a whole lot more. And it kept getting bigger and bigger and bigger, and it was looking like one of these stalactites, but it kept getting bigger to the point where they were having to add pipe. I was there last year, and it's kind of big now. It was started in 1903. They know that. You see, stuff doesn't take millions and millions of years, folks. What I hope that you're seeing is, as you peel back the evidence, it keeps pointing back to a creator.